Yeah, first of all, thanks to the Center for Latin American Studies and the Radical Americans Network for counting on us here in the sociology department. We've been growing in political sociology, and we're very interested in talking about politically salient, relevant events around the world. More recently, we've even hired someone who's a specialist in Latin America, so we hope to continue working with you guys closely. Let me just say briefly, I agree with you very much that this 20th anniversary is a very important moment. The Zapatista Uprising, I'm from California, and I'm also amongst young people in California as well started looking at this. And it's a real moment, along with, let's say, 1989, the Caracazo in Venezuela, really sparking a resurgence of resistance to neoliberalism, and for that reason it continues to have symbolic resonance, but is also a movement that continues to this day, so it's worth really thinking about. And we have a great panel here of experts to help us situate what I hope will be a fruitful discussion. We'll begin with Professor Aida Hernandez, who will give us a brief background about the Zapatista Uprising, following by Dr. Sarah Washbrook, who will talk to us for about 10 minutes each of these, introduce us to the question of indigenous, the indigenous background of Chiapaneco history, followed by Professor John Gledhill, who will discuss resistance to state and security in Mexico, and then Dr. Bill Booth, who will talk about media reactions to the Zapatista Uprising, and then finally Geoff Goodwin, who will talk about the comparative perspective, the 1994 indigenous levantamiento in Ecuador. So we'll begin with Aida Hernandez, who is the Simón Bolívar Chair at the Center of Latin American Studies, Cambridge, and is currently a professor and senior researcher at CIESAS, the Center for Research and Advanced Studies in Social Anthropology in Mexico City. She earned her doctorate in anthropology from Stanford University, the recipient of the Martin Disc Oxley Award for her activist research, including interests covering over ethnic studies, legal and political anthropology, post-colonial feminisms, and activist research. She is the author of Dissident Women, Gender, and Cultural Politics in Chiapas, Mayan Lives, Mayan Utopias, The Indigenous Peoples of Chiapas, and the Zapatista Rebellion. And her more recent book is Sur Profundo, Identidades Indígenas en la Frontera Chiapas, Guatemala. So I think with that, your curriculum speaks for yourself. You speak for yourself as well.
Thank you. Well, I was very excited to hear that the class students were willing to organize something like this event, and coming from Argentina. Presently, I think they're the only one student who's working in Mexico. And so it was for me, it was a very exciting opportunity to share some of my knowledge, but also some of my experience, direct experience. Because as Juan Pablo, although I'm older than him, as you can imagine, I'm part of a generation of scholars that was much influenced by the cultural climate that was created after the Zapatista Uprising in 1994. I was in the middle of my field work in the border between Guatemala and Mexico when the Zapatista Uprising started, and it really made me rethink my research project, but also the kind of theoretical debates in which I was engaged in that moment. And it was many of you must know, I don't know if the new generation probably is not part of the youngest one of their intellectual genealogy, but it was in the 1st of January of 1994 that a group of indigenous people from the different regions of Chiapas took over different municipalities in the state of Chiapas. But it was not a coincidence that it was in January 1st, 1994, because it was the first day of the initiation of the free trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So it was very symbolic that this movement have chosen that date, because as a part of their demands, they were criticizing the kind of effects that the structural adjustment policies were having in rural Mexico, but in general in all the marginalized peoples of the country. And in a broader sense, they were discussing what kind of civilizatory path were we taking with the globalization of neoliberal industrial model. So I remember that when they were talking immediately, they made public the Declaración de la Selva Candona, de la Candona General Declaration, many intellectuals, including some anthropologists, were saying somebody must be behind those indigenous rebels because indigenous people do not discuss about free trade agreements. So they are discussing, they are very linked to their cosmologies and they are concerned about their local issues, but not about free trade agreements. In that moment, I was doing my field work with an organic growers cooperative, coffee organic growers, and as a part of their workshops to belong to the organic grower cooperatives, they have something that was called the TCO, the Trabajo Común Organizado, common organized work, in which they have to discuss what were the effects of the new neoliberal policies in the coffee industry. So the kind of perceptions of who indigenous peoples were became obvious, and all the racism that marked the Mexican society. And I think that something that was very important as part of this cultural climate that I'm talking about is the way in which the Zapatista movement was making a linkage between different levels of injustice. I was very recently reading the book of Nancy Fraser, the different scales of justice, and I was thinking a lot about how the Zapatista movement since 1994 was dealing with those different levels of injustice, because they were very concerned with the issue of racism and the neo-colonial relationships that existed between urban center and between mestizo society and indigenous society. They were very concerned with the kind of globalization and neoliberal industrial model that Mexico was entering into and the kind of impact that it had for the future of indigenous communities. And at the community level, they were also very concerned about the internal exclusions that indigenous women were suffering within their own communities. As I said before in some of my talks, something that is very specific of the Zapatista movement is that it was the first guerrilla movement in the Americas that considered the concerns of the specific demands of women as part of their political agenda. The Frente Farabundo Martí en El Salvador, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the URNG in Guatemala, the Tupamaros, none of those groups had considered the concerns of women. And this had been very central for the construction of a specific society project in which the issue of exclusion and the issue of the redistribution is very linked to the issue of the recognition of the diverse identities. And so since the beginning of the movement, something that it's probably some of the new generation do not know is that it was a guerrilla movement that was on arms only for 10 days. So after those 10 days, it had been a political, social movement that had decided to use different kinds of strategies to struggle for social change. Many of those struggles are direct to the Mexican state and to the reconstitution and reconceptualization of what the nation state is. But other strategies were very linked to a global movement that is rethinking what kind of civilizatory path do we want to take. So it was because of this concern with building global networks is that many people were talking about postmodern guerrilla, they were talking about what was how for example, the use of media had been so central. Somebody's going to talk here in a minute about that. And so since the beginning of the movement, something that was very specific of the movement is that when they started the negotiation, after those 10 days, they went into peace talks with the state representatives. And since the beginning, they said, well, we are not going to take any decision by ourselves. We want to invite civil society. That takes for an entire discussion how civil society was used politically, but how it was understood by indigenous communities. It became a very objectivized concept. They said, oh, the civil society is going to the latrina, so the civil society went there. So it was used to refer to all the solidarity people that were around. But it was an invitation of the Mexican civil society to participate in those peace talks. Since the beginning, it was the first encounter in which 500 indigenous people from 32 different indigenous communities came to Chiapas before the peace talks to discuss with the Zapatistas what kind of concerns they had. And they also invite, as advisors, different representatives of social movement. And I had the experience and the privilege to be invited as an advisor to the peace talks as a member of an NGO that was working with indigenous and women's rights. That was called El Grupo de Mujeres de San Cristóbal Las Casas. So I, in a way, had been an analyst of those processes, but also part of this social subject that has participated directly in this process. And in that sense, academically, I always think about the importance of doing an ethnography of the social movements, of this daily life, how the decisions were taken, who discussed those decisions, because the agreement that were signed in February 16, 1996, that are known as the San Andres Accord agreements between the government and the Zapatista rebellions, were the result of a year-long gatherings and meetings between indigenous people, social movements, people that work against transnational projects as dams, people that were working for women's rights, people from the LGBT movement. So these diverse social movements were getting together to discuss what kind of national project they were concerned with. And there were a lot of tensions going on, and how, for example, something that was during the peace talks, we have 10 minutes, so I should wrap. During the peace talks, they organized panels on certain topics. So it was a topic under women's rights. And in that topic of women's rights, the representative of the Mexican state were also indigenous women. And some of the advisors or the people that were invited by the Zapatistas were indigenous Zapatista women, but also feminists. And some of the feminists, among them a very well-known actress, was very, very rude with the indigenous woman that represent the Mexican state. And the Zapatista women were very upset about it. And they called for respect in the way the peace talks were taking place, and to respect also those women that were coming. So all those dynamics were very interesting, and were saying a lot of the kind of cultural politics that was being built. And I just want to, I'm not gonna, we just have 10 minutes, but something that I want to point out is that because of the way the media works in Mexico, many people think that the Zapatista movement has disappeared, that there is nothing else going on. And what had happened in the last 5-7 years had been a very interesting and amazing project of construction of indigenous autonomy. Since 2003, the Zapatista movement decided that all its call to the national civil society to construct a coalition movement to rebuild the nation was not working. We can talk a lot about the division in the left, the kind of, well, the issues that all, they have different names, El Frente Zapatista, La Otra Campaña, but the left in Mexico and the progressive movement that are expert in dividing and struggling among them, was not able to articulate any big alliance. So they decide to bid for the construction of the autonomic regions. And they constructed a model of autonomy that it's built by 5 caracoles that are the names of the autonomic regions, in which they have created their own autonomic health system, education system. There are right now 600 education promoters and health promoters that have been formed in the Zapatista movement, and they have 500 houses of health, autonomic houses of health. They are not receiving any help at all from the Mexican state in the construction of their own autonomic project, and they're concerned with linking this society project, Proyecto Societal, I don't know, societal project, to a broader project to rethink the kind of economic model that we want. Their latest effort had been the Little Schools for Freedom that took place just last December and last August. The first one was last summer, and the second one just last December, in which they invite people from all over Mexico and all over the world to come to the Zapatista autonomy region and learn about autonomy with indigenous families. And there were 1,700 people. I was going through the records of how the last meeting took place. And it was interesting because among them, there were 40 PhD students among the 1,700 people that went to the Little Schools for Freedom, who stayed there in their communities. And they were people from 32 different countries, people from Sri Lanka, people from India, people from many different countries in Latin America, going to the autonomic regions to live within a Zapatista family and learn about the meaning of autonomy in daily life. And I belong now to a network that is called La Red de Feminismos Descoloniales, the Colonial Feminist Network. And some of the members went there, and the kind of experience that they had in learning what autonomy is in real life, in ground life, it was very moving. So I think that one of the issues is that although we don't have all the media attention that the Zapatista movement used to have, the project is still there and is building and has a new experiment of how to rethink the relationships between men and women, between nature and society.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to listen to Dr. Sarah Washbrook. She's currently a research associate in the Center for Global History at Oxford. She holds a DPhil in Modern History from Oxford as well, and she's a British Academy postdoctoral research fellow at the Latin American Center at Oxford. Her research interests focus on the history of modern Latin America from the late 18th century to the present day, with an emphasis on global and regional market development, exports, post-colonial governance, and nation-state building and modernization, labor, race, and ethnicity. She's author of Producing Modernity in Mexico, Labor, Race, and the State in Chiapas, and Rural Chiapas, 10 years after the Zapatista Uprising. And she's going to speak to us about the indigenous background of Chiapaneco history.
Okay, thank you. Well, when Bill invited me to come today, he said, oh, I want you to talk about lingerie in 5 minutes. I was like, wow, that's quite a task. So I'm going to try and keep it to about 10 minutes. And when I've got some slides, I'm not going to be able to go into everything in depth, obviously, but it's something you can sort of read some of the dates and things which are kind of what I would say are important dates and moments if we're thinking about the history of Chiapas. I'm going to focus on the last 500 years, particularly the last 200 years. My DPhil is in the Porfiriato, which is the period from 1876 to 1910. So that's kind of my area of specialisation. But I wanted to locate the kind of the changes which I know more about within the longer history, and also present kind of the indigenous background of the Zapatista uprising in a sort of long-term perspective. So I'm going to say some things which maybe some of you who know the history of Chiapas, this is familiar. It might be new to others of you. One of the things when thinking about Chiapas, it was actually part of Central America during the colonial period. It wasn't part of Mexico, New Spain. And joined Mexico in 1824 definitively. So that's something when we're thinking about sort of the ethnic composition, the population, the history of the region, it's important to note that it obviously has a lot in common with Guatemala for historical reasons to do with administration as well as other things. The conquistadors arrived in 1528, and they found that sort of several different ethnic groups, which is still important within Chiapas today. There were the Zoques, who live more in the isthmus region towards Oaxaca, so sort of a hot climate, and the Chiapaneco group as well. Now the Zoques and the Chiapanecos were integrated into the Aztec Empire, principally producing cacao, whereas the Mayas, who speak the four different languages that we recognise today, Santanto, Chol, and Polaval, were really sort of not integrated within the long-term trade networks to do with the Aztec Empire. Encomienda was established by the Spanish in the 1530s, and the Dominicans arrived in 1544. So Bartolomé de las Casas, who's well known for his sort of discussion about indigenous rights, he was a bishop of Chiapas, he was a Dominican, there in the 1540s. And his sort of discussions, he had great conflicts with the Cabildo of San Cristobal, the Ciudad Real in those days, to do with the treatment of indigenous people in Encomienda. So there's a sort of a very long history of a concern for human rights, indigenous rights, and conflict between those who came to be known as Indians as being tribute to the category of paying tribute to the crown, because there's a big differences within that will be said as Indian or indigenous nowadays. And in the 16th century, one of the processes which happened was that these different indigenous groups, calcules, they were congregated into what became what we term Indian communities or Indian towns. And there's certain sort of institutions which sort of perhaps mark or became very much associated with Indian ethnicity, the cabildo, which sort of becomes transformed into the municipality and quite a contentious relationship between the two after independence. Cofradías, which are religious brotherhoods, which have both sort of Mesoamerica have a very important role in indigenous ethnicity through the colonial period and into the 19th century. Of course, the indigenous population, they have to pay tribute to the crown. That's what marks them out as Indians, that they're paying tribute to the crown, and have religious taxes. And in Chiapas, the repartimientos, which is a kind of corvée labour, and repartimiento trade, which says a sort of monopoly market, a controlled market, is very important during the colonial period. And of course, as in the rest of Mesoamerica, there's a population decline, significant population decline in the 16th, 7th century. So, sort of estimate of about 275,000 people in the province of Chiapas in 1520, reduces to around 78,000 in 1611. So, those are some of the sort of broader processes during the colonial period, which are important when we're thinking about what is indigenous, what does it mean to be Indian in Chiapas, and sort of the colonial element of it. So, sort of in broad brush terms, we can say during the colonial period, the majority of the population was concentrated in Indian towns in the central highlands. Because the lowland regions are where the epidemics are most severe, the highlands, central highlands, become the area where the population was most concentrated. This is a map. This is actually from 1846. But I just wanted to bring it in because if you'll see that the towns are all marked sort of towards the north of the map. But this is really a schematic map because it's not, the map doesn't look like that now. But this vast region sort of, which says Sierra Madre, which isn't really mapped and there's very little population. The map's like that because it's tribute is still very important. There is the development of a sort of state agriculture from the 1780s, but principally that the population is concentrated in that area, and the map is really to do with population modelling, geography and land, because the land topography isn't really like that, as we'll see a bit later on. So the point is that it's a tributary economy. Land production is not very important in the colonial period, and associated with the tributary economy, as in Yucatan and in Central America, for example, division between Indian and Spaniard is very important. There's a very small Spanish population, a very large indigenous population, and the economy basically depends on tribute extracted from the Indian population. There's an important rebellion in 1712 called the Saltao Rebellion, which nearly brings down Spanish colonial rule in the region. I'm not going to go into that now, but it's just to sort of say there's a history of rebellion and of indigenous rebellion within Chiapas. And as I noticed, there's a growth of the state agriculture after 1780, particularly in this area where there's no towns actually marked, which is the central lowlands. That region becomes important that period. Okay, so just very quickly, the period 1824 to 1867, the Republic of the Indios is ended, so the separate sort of indigenous category. There's the establishment of the municipality after independence, but in those towns which are predominantly indigenous, the Indian ethno-political institutions and structures continue to be very important. So there's a civil religious hierarchy remains important, principales, and we can say governance, although it kind of fits in the sort of the liberal institutional structure, it's very much a kind of mix with older political structures which come from the pre-colonial period and the colonial period. So there's continuity and also some changes. Land privatisation becomes particularly important after 1824, especially after 1844. There's a land law which allows the privatisation of large amounts of land within where that area on the map where there's a lot of indigenous towns lose their land to land privatisation. Although it's not developed necessarily at that period because communications are very poor, so market development is poor. So we see the growth of fincas, haciendas, the establishment of labour tenancy and debt peonage. There's a debt peonage law in 1827. So people talk about debt peonage, they often think of the colonial period, but debt peonage is actually not very important in Chiapas in the colonial period, only on the estates of the Dominicans. It really is a post-colonial invention, so I think that's something that's important when we're thinking about labour in the 19th century. And so one of the things during this period, the sort of power of the church wanes, the sort of secular state becomes more important, and with the liberal victory in 1867, that sort of certainly takes off. There is conflict between federalists and conservatives, liberals stroke federalists and centralists stroke conservatives who come from two different regional zones. This is a quote Jan Lewis, who says that the conflicts between these different sort of political elites was never so much over ideology or future models of society as over the division of the spoils left by the colony. So he's talking there about basically the indigenous population, which is that there's no mines in this area, so the tribute produced by the indigenous population is the basis of the colonial economy, and that is the basis of political conflict in the 19th century. There's a caste war in 1869, it's known as the caste war. I mean, this is a really very excellent piece of work by Jan Lewis, which talks about whose caste war. He says it's not really about ethnicity, it's about, as in the sense of sort of two primordial racial groups fighting against each other. It's really about politics and autonomy and taxation, and he sort of questions the narrative of what actually happens. He shows that it's really related to sort of the process of the Civil War and the liberal victory in 1867. So you can say it's a sort of move for autonomy, which is religious and political, fiscal autonomy, which is crushed by Ladino elites. Both liberals and conservatives, who were bitter enemies during the war, sort of come together to see an end to that movement. These are just two quick slides. So we can say by about 1870, economically, Chiapas is divided becoming particularly divided into the finca, which is the unit of agricultural production, and on the other hand, the indigenous communities, which serve increasingly as a source of labour for the sort of the developing agricultural estate economy. So 1876, I put the dating of the ending of Porfiriato Chiapas to 1914, really, which is when the Constitution's troops arrive, and sort of very much start to change the political and institutional structure. The Porfiriato's sort of characterised by a process of political centralisation, undermining municipal autonomy, which is officially the Mexican political structure allows for municipal autonomy. And when I my research, one of the things which I saw was sort of the tighter incorporation of Indian political structures and into practices of central state rule. So sometimes the Indian communities can be considered outside the state. And my argument from my research during the Porfiriato was that very much that wasn't the case. One of the process of political centralisation was penetrating those communities to be able to mobilise labour, for example, collect taxes. So that's just one of the things I would point to, is that the indigenous communities is a process which is very much accelerated, deepened during the revolutionary period, but you certainly see it during the Porfiriato. So we see during this period the growth of the export sector, particularly coffee, and also hardwoods from the Selva Dona in the north of the state. There's foreign investment, increasing taxation, there's labour recruitment of indigenous labour from the towns to the growing sort of agro-export sector, and the reinforcement of debt peonage and core labour on public work. So labour recruitment becomes increasingly onerous, taxation is increasingly onerous during this period. At the same time, land privatisation accelerates. There's expansion of fincas and the peonage at the expense of the indigenous peasantry. And just to think about in terms of population statistics, about 2/3 of the population is considered indigenous in 1910. About half the population resides on fincas, or in some regions it's much less, 10%, other regions it's up to 75%. And about 35 to 40% of the time through debt to either fincas or property. And that I'm talking about because it's about Chiapas in 1910, which virtually is the same as the one that we would look at now. And this comes because this colonisation companies surveyed the land during the Porfiriato. So that's when we get kind of what is a much more accurate map of the state. And this is a German coffee finger from the north of the state, just to show how foreign investment was important and development of the state agriculture. Okay, so I'm just going to skip to the revolution, which is not my particular area of specialisation, but there is an uprising in 1911 from the Central Highlands. There's this elite split between the Highlands and the Lowlands. The elites in the Highlands call themselves panellistas, so they're allied to the Mannerista movement, which topples Diaz eventually in 1911. And they have an alliance with Tzotzil Indians from the same region as them, which seems a rather strange alliance because many of those elites were the ones who were taking land away from the indigenous communities. But they're both sort of allied against the state government. And on that sort of in historiography, that uprising, it's often the indigenous people are often sort of either portrayed as being duped by the Highlands elites. This is the sort of the lowlands interpretation, that they were duped by the Highlands elites, or the Highlands sort of elites see it as being, well, you know, they made the right decision. It was, you know, they knew that we were right, sort of thing. And Jan Moos, whose work I quoted, he's working on this. He's an anthropologist, historian, and over the years, he's been working in Chiapas for many years, and he was telling me that they're collecting about 80 oral histories of this rebellion, and he's going to change the historiography completely, and he's going to show that the Tzotzil Indians, it was actually, they had their own autonomous rebellion, and one of the reasons that there was a split that developed between the Ladino elites and the indigenous, and the Ladino elites kind of pulled out, if you like, at the last minute and basically betrayed the indigenous population and the Highlands. So there's going to be a real sort of showing that was another moment in which there was rebellion and autonomous, and sort of the Indians were protagonising that movement. Anyway, in 1914, the Constitution was survived. They institute the Ley de la Liberación de Mossos, which basically ends step peonage in the state. Provokes a counter-revolution from elites, both the Highlands and Lowlands elites, but they fail to understand indigenous issues or to get popular groups behind them and what they're trying to do. In 1920, counter-revolutionaries win, make a pact with Álvaro Obregón, and that's one of the things that kind of marks the 20th century in Chiapas. It's a myth that the revolution never arrived in Chiapas, but the way that it had an impact is because the political elite that still retain a large amount of power, so they can kind of sort of shape the revolution, if you like. So in the 1930s, this labour organising the union peasants and migrant workers, and land reform, which was federalised in 1934. This is a picture of panellistas in 1914 arriving in Tuxtla. And then just quickly, John Ross again, I'm quoting, he says, this is a period where there are new forms of political domination and caciquismo, and he says that institutionalised revolutionary communities are harnessed to the state. So revolution, in a way, sort of carries on what was happening in the Porfiriato, of the community becoming tied to the modern state. Land reform was extensive, but it was principally, and this is quoting here from Wales, it was principally a process of colonisation rather than redistribution. So rather than, there's a lot of land which is unoccupied, which is then given to peasants, but there's no distribution, it doesn't change the political relations within the state. The plantation model, which becomes important at the end of the 19th century, sort of is entered into crisis in the 1970s. And there's a sort of growing peasant radicalism. Land reform is aimed at relieving social pressures. One of the things which is important is that even though the revolutionary state has a presence in the indigenous communities from the 1930s, there's not really any access to indigenous payoffs and thinkers. And debt peonage continues in Chiapas into the 1970s and 1980s. And so it's really, what happens is rather than there being a major, the state suddenly becoming interested, it's because of the changes in the political economy. A lot of Figueroas start producing cattle and expel the peons, and many of those peons then go to the selva, and that's part of sort of the mix of populations which become the area where the Zapatistas are strongest. The 1980s and 1990s, there's a removal of state subsidies, so we're talking about neoliberalism, sort of the Mexican state that has the capacity to subsidise agriculture. There's an escalation of violence among peasant groups and peasants in the state. And within this kind of cauldron of sort of struggles and political grievances, there's also this religious groups become important, and ethnic identity becomes increasingly politicised. So, some sort of conclusions. Indigenous history is key to understanding the processes that led to 1994 and those that have resulted from 1994, but it's not a primordial identity. We have to locate the idea of Indian indigenous identity within the context of wider social, political and economic processes, so the colonial, national and the revolutionary state, the relationship with the state, tributary economy, export production and its demise, and also to say that indigenous political identity grew from the 1970s, but it was never separate from class-based or peasant identity, nor was it outside the modern state. I'm sorry.
Thank you for that very effective, long array overview, 10-15 minutes there. Okay, so next we're going to turn to Professor John Gledhill, who's going to talk to us about resistance of state and security in Mexico. John Gledhill is the Max Gluckman Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Manchester, a fellow of the British Academy and a member of the UK Academy for Social Sciences. He completed his PhD at Oxford University and taught at UCL for 20 years and in Mexican universities as well. He specialized in political, economic, and historical anthropology. He's the author of a classic and major study of agrarian reform in Mexico, Casi Nada, a study of agrarian reform in the homeland of Cardenismo, published in the Spanish edition in 1993, for published in 1991. Also the author of Neoliberalism, Transnationalization, and Rural Poverty, a case study of Michoacán, Mexico. And his most recent book is New Approaches to Resistance in Brazil and Mexico. So it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Well, I'm an anthropologist, so this is going to be a kind of sort of report from the field, as analytical as there. Hopefully it will stimulate some kind of discussion. My own last visit to Chiapas was in mid-2012, so I went back to Brazil before the Zapatista silent march in December that year reminded Mexicans that the Zapatistas still existed. Unfortunately, so I missed that spectacle. But I went to Chiapas after spending 3 months in Michoacán, which is the other part of Mexico I've done a lot of work in over the last 35 years. Nervously moving around in a space that was now visibly controlled by the Guerrilleros Templarios drug cartel, which is by this stage become a mass mafia in the classical sense, controlling all of the local governments and pretty well the entire economy of Mexico. Now, although I visited all my old haunts and old friends in Michoacán in this trip, I was particularly interested in the fate of the Nahua indigenous community on the Pacific coast that I studied from 2001 to 2003. It's a place called Ostula. In 2006, a group of leaders in Ostula declared themselves supporters of the Zapatistas, the otra campaña, sexta declaración, Monte Zapatismo, and the community received a personal visit of solidarity from Subcomandante Marcos. So actually, it was rather comic because one of these people are very autonomous. And I stick his hand and said, "We've suffered 500 years of deceit. How can we know who you say you are?" And Marcos was just for once in his life lost for words and finally said, "Well, I'm a kind of revolutionary commander, so I don't actually have my electoral credentials." Okay. And these folks in Ostula became the principal allies of the self-defense force of the Purépecha community in Cherán, the central highlands of the state, which has become very important. And in fact, Ostula was the first community, even before Cherán, to establish one of these self-defense forces based on its long-standing indigenous communal police force. And that's rather similar in structure to the neighbouring communities in Guerrero State, which is part of Mexico, has long-standing connections. They all speak now spoken out origin. Now, Australia's been in the national news again over the past week, and I'm going to spend quite a lot of time talking about that because I think it is very instructive in terms of this theme of resistance to state and security to look at this Zapatista outlier in the Michoacán coastline. It's a very, very long way from Chiapas, and a very different kind of historical and cultural environment. But let me say a few things first about my last visit to Chiapas. Well, in comparison with Michoacán, as you might imagine, Chiapas actually looked fairly well policed and tranquil, but of course that's a quite superficial impression that you will get arriving as a tourist if you didn't have any contact with any local people. And the tensions that beneath the surface weren't just to do with these Zapatista autonomous communities, which have continued to suffer continual harassment by the army, and paramilitaries are getting more and more active again. And so one of the things I decided to do, because it kind of related to what I was doing in Michoacán, was go down to this mestizo municipality, which is on the border with Guatemala, Chiapaneco. This is a part of Chiapas where people don't think of themselves as indigenous, almost the word indigenous origin, but they don't think of themselves right now. But this community was in a big conflict with the Blackfire mining company, which is of course Canadian, and it proved business as usual by Michoacán standards. First of all, the leader of the environmentalists leading this movement against the mine is harassed by the state government, in prison for a bit, on the behest of the mine owners in Canada, and then he gets shot dead by unknown assassins who have been brought to justice. So that was one aspect of what I saw in Chiapas. Another aspect of what I saw in Chiapas made me think I'd actually kind of stepped into a time warp. I paid a visit to a shiny new so-called sustainable rural city of Santiago El Pinar, which all my activist friends have denounced as, it's this counterinsurgency Mark III, this sustainable rural cities. But, well, maybe that's the intention, but what it actually reminded me was of all the things I saw in the 70s. The old pre with the Party of the Institutional Revolution, with all these integrated rural development projects were total failures. Everybody looted the money, but they had no development impact whatsoever. And what Santiago El Pinar is it's a new settlement, lovely little blue houses, lovely in the photo, dotted against the hill, except they're made of kind of almost of cardboard. They have no electricity or water, so nobody could live in them for that reason. And anyway, they're far too small to house the average rural family. So it's a kind of simulation of rural development. The cooperative industries in this place aren't sustainable, not only do they get state government subsidies, the state government buys what they produce because there are no markets for these products. So something very strange was happening under ex-governor Juan Sabines, and it's probably still happening under a successor, Velasco. And what did seem to be flourishing in Chiapas is a kind of contraband economy which is distinct from organised crime, although they're not totally independent, but they are kind of distinct, which the state, as Alan has pointed out, chooses to make invisible. And maybe it's that kind of thing that, to a certain extent, helps keep the lid on the situation in Chiapas. But certainly, if you look at ex-Governor Sabines' development project, what is the point of building municipal markets that hardly anybody uses in every town in Chiapas? Well, maybe it's keeping political peace, maybe it's patronage, and maybe it's just making all your friends happy with the contracts. But the more serious thing I began to suspect was that organised crime had kind of made a pact with this state administration, so that all the atrocious stuff, because all these migrants from Central America are coming through Chiapas, but they don't get horribly treated until they've left Chiapas. So why is that? But anyway, just to end, that would be speculation, but to end on what isn't speculation, to take Aida's point, these Zapatista communities have continue to build their autonomy. That's what they've been doing while they appear to be visible. There's a whole generation of new young people that have been won to this project. And what I can say, as a photographer, is building development by this autonomous path is incredibly hard. I mean, it is very difficult. It's not without its internal social and political tensions. I mean, we shouldn't romanticize this struggle. It is very, very difficult. People get pissed off with each other, people get frustrated, but the fact that they're managing to do this, and sometimes also people make compromises with local forces just to keep going. But the fact they're managing to do this is an achievement that really deserves enormous respect and admiration. But then we do have the question of this larger national picture, the larger Zapatista political project, which is, as you just said, yes, now seems to be on the back burner. And that's why what happened on the Michoacán coast is, and all these questions of the relationships between the state, security and resistance, I think are quite illuminating. I went to study Astula in the first place because it had a remarkable history, long-term history of resistance to dispossession and genocide. Second, Sarah's point about indigenous protagonism. These indigenous people were the protagonists of independence in this part of Mexico. They led the southern black communities of the coast, militarily and politically. In modern times, in 2009, the Astula communal police took back control of this strategically placed area of land that's near the coast itself, near the sea, that had long been disputed with people from this neighbouring mestizo community of La Casita, which is the home of the Templarios regional boss and a long-standing narco-priester who finally, because his name is in one of these papers, I can name as Lico Gonzalez, except Lico is, I'm afraid, long gone, and therefore escaping me into defences. And to cut a very long, complicated story short, what happened was that in 2010, the Astula Self-Defense Force was disarmed by the military, and then 28 communal leaders were assassinated. One. The facts of all these indicate the complicity at all three levels of government, local, state and federal. And this is a good example of why the federal government is not the solution to Mexico's security problems. One of the most awful deaths was the death of the 73-year-old leader, Don Trinidad de la Cruz, who somebody interviewed in Happy Time. He left the community and taken refuge for 4 weeks after publicly receiving death threats that all the local people reported to the public attorney's office by name. I mean, the people who didn't threaten by name of the hand. He comes back, he's escorted with members of Javier Sicilia's movement for peace, for justice and dignity, middle-class activists, escorted by the federal police. What happens? They get off the main road, federal police vanish, paramilitaries arrive and torture and kill this poor old man over an extended period of time. So what's going on here? Well, it's about lots of business interests in roads, tourism and mining that actually connect all the political parties together, which is why all levels of government are involved. Illegal trading in minerals is a very important part of the portfolio, and it connects its shadow regional economy with China. And in return for the iron ore that goes out to China, the chemicals you use for crystal meth and cocaine processing come back from the Chinese through the Communist port. But the Italo-Argentine transnational Ternium that owns the local iron ore, the legal iron ore mine, is also implicated in this scenario, because they want to mine in indigenous territories, and indigenous people don't want to let them. Yes, what's happening. So if you look at it from that perspective, we're talking about a kind of deniable violence committed by paramilitaries that are actually working for a whole range of other respectable interests. But the story is more complicated than that. So, I mean, the indigenous community did divide. Young people were already themselves consuming methamphetamines, and two rival drug cartels at one point finally came together, supplied different groups of kids with guns, they started killing each other. until the situation stabilised. The older leaders were killed. Younger people who would continue resistance then went into exile. So what happened last week was that a group of these exiles were able to return because the general development of the active defence movement throughout the state, with the tacit support now of the federal government, enabled the new active defence to form in the municipal seat at Aquila, and they supported the indigenous people, so it's now possible to occupy the main settlement of the centre of the local criminal economy. So this was a resistance that at one point had almost collapsed. It's kind of revived in a new environment. But this environment, and this is the point I want to kind of end on, it raises all sorts of questions of its own. Who are these self-defence forces? Well, unfortunately, we've developed in places which I know quite well. I mean, some of them are financed by local businessmen and farmers who are fed up of paying extortion money to the mafia. Others are just angry young citizens, They managed to capture enough of the Templars' guns, that we can stand and fight. But there are also ex-Templars in there. There are people who were previously working for the cartels in these groups, and the Templars themselves include lots of people who used to brand themselves as Zapatista, another drug cartel in the earlier moment. So we've got these kind of permanent professional armed actors